All right, so today we're diving into something uh, pretty mind-bending, honestly. We're tackling this idea of cancer as a metabolic disease.
Okay.
And I gotta say, the stuff you sent over really, just totally shifted how I think about cancer.
Yeah, it's definitely a different way of looking at it for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, everyone always talks about, the gene theory, right?
Right.
Cancer is just cells going haywire because they're, messed up DNA.
Yeah, mutations, basically.
Exactly. But the book you've been digging into, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease by Thomas Seyfried,
Yeah.
he's like, whoa, hold up. What if those genetic glitches are more like a symptom than the actual cause?
Interesting.
And instead, he's pointing to something way more basic, how cells make energy.
That's the core of his argument, yeah. He's saying cancer is primarily a disease of energy production, specifically problems with the mitochondria.
Mitochondria, those little powerhouses inside every cell, right?
Exact-
And this isn't some totally out there idea either. We've known about the Warburg effect for a century almost. You know how cancer cells prefer this less efficient way of making energy?
Right, even when there's plenty of oxygen around, they opt for fermentation instead of respiration.
It's like they're choosing the gas guzzler over the electric car, even though there's a charging station right there.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head scratcher, for sure.
So why are we just now starting to question this whole gene-centric view?
Well, I think it's partly because the gene theory has had some successes. I mean, it's led to some advancements in treatment, but maybe we need to consider if we've become too fixated on genes. Maybe it's like tunnel vision, preventing us from seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so let's back up a sec. Remind me, how do cells make energy anyway? What are the main ways?
Sure. So there's respiration, which happens in the mitochondria and uses oxygen efficiently.
Right.
And then there's fermentation, which doesn't need oxygen, but is way less efficient.
So Seyfried's saying cancer cells are basically going for the less efficient option, even though oxygen is available. Why would they do that?
His argument is that their mitochondria are damaged.
Oh,
So they can't do that efficient respiration thing. It's like if your city's power grid goes down, you got to rely on backup generators, even if they're not as good.
gotcha. So damaged mitochondria are like the root of all this metabolic chaos. But how does that actually lead to, all the hallmarks of cancer, like the out-of-control growth and all that?
Well, it's not just about the lack of energy. Mitochondria do way more than just produce ATP. They're involved in signaling, regulating cell death, even keeping the DNA stable.
Wait, are you saying our DNA's integrity is linked to how well our mitochondria are working?
Exactly. And Seyfried's research shows that tumor cell mitochondria are often messed up, fewer in number, structurally weird, and not working right. It's like trying to run a complex machine with missing parts and bad wiring.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connections here. Faulty mitochondria, energy crisis, and then the whole cell goes haywire. But what about the genes? If it's not primarily about mutations, why do we see so many genetic changes in cancer cells?
That's where the retrograde response comes in.
You're
Because
right.
when mitochondria are struggling, they send out distress signals to the nucleus, the cell's control center.
So it's like a metabolic SOS.
Exactly. And this retrograde response causes a bunch of changes. A shift towards fermentation, and this is important, an increase in genomic instability. The cell's DNA becomes more prone to errors, and those errors can pile up, leading to the mutations we see in cancer.
So the mutations might be a result of the metabolic problems, not the cause.
That's the heart of Seyfried's argument. It's a pretty big shift in how we think about cancer.
Totally. It really challenges the idea that cancer is purely genetic. And this has huge implications for treatment. If we could fix the energy problem at the cellular level, could we potentially reverse the whole thing?
That's the big question driving a lot of research right now. And we'll get into the treatment possibilities in a bit.
Okay.
But first, I think we should talk about how this metabolic view challenges the idea of cancer as an evolutionary process. You know, that whole survival of the fittest cell concept?
Oh, yeah, mutations give some cells an advantage and they take over.
Exactly. But Seyfried says tumor cells might not be as adaptable as we think, especially when it comes to dealing with metabolic stress.
Whoa, okay, now I'm really intrigued. Let's unpack that evolutionary angle next.
So we were talking about this idea of cancer as like a Darwinian process, right? Survival of the fittest cell.
Right, yeah. Where mutations give certain cells a leg up and they just kind of take over.
That's the dominant view.
Uh,
But Seyfried's like, hold on a sec. He thinks tumor cells might actually be less adaptable, especially when it comes to energy stress.
Really? Huh. I always figured cancer cells were like the ultimate survivors. They're outsmarting the body's defenses at every turn.
Yeah, that's the common perception. But Seyfried points to this fascinating research that kind of flips that on its head.
Okay.
There were these studies where they took the nucleus of a tumor cell, the part with all the DNA,
Yeah.
and they stuck it into a healthy egg cell, one with normal mitochondria.
So they basically gave the tumor cell's brain like a brand new body.
Yeah, you could say that. And the crazy thing is these hybrid cells often develop totally normally, no tumors.
Whoa, so the tumor-forming ability wasn't just because of the messed up genes in the nucleus. It points back to the mitochondria, right?
Exactly. It suggests that a healthy metabolic environment, provided by those functioning mitochondria, can actually override the genetic predisposition to cancer.
That's pretty wild. It really
Mhm.
challenges how we think about cancer developing.
Yeah.
But if these faulty mitochondria are so important, why haven't we focused on them more in research and treatment?
It's a good question. I think historically there's been such a huge emphasis on the nucleus, mapping the human genome, finding cancer-causing genes. And while those things are definitely important, maybe the role of mitochondria got overshadowed a bit.
It's like we were so busy reading the instruction manual, we forgot to check if the factory had power.
Haha, I like that. And that's why Seyfried's work is so crucial. He's pushing us to look beyond just the genes and consider the whole energy landscape of the cell.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff. But let's get practical for a sec. How does this metabolic view actually change treatment strategies?
Well, one of the most talked about approaches is the ketogenic diet, or KD.
Oh, yeah, the high-fat, low-carb one.
That's the one. The basic idea is that by cutting way back on glucose, you force the body to burn fat for fuel. And that basically starves the cancer cells.
Interesting. Because cancer cells love glucose, right?
Yeah, they gobble it up. But healthy cells can adapt and use ketone bodies, which are made from fat breakdown.
So it's like giving the good guys a gourmet meal and the bad guys are stuck with junk food.
Uh-huh. Yeah, something like that. The KD tries to create an environment where healthy cells have the advantage and cancer cells struggle.
And Seyfried is a big fan of this approach.
He is. He sees it as a foundational therapy, a way to make things tough for cancer cells while boosting the body's own defenses.
But isn't the keto diet, like, super hard to stick to?
It can be tough at first. It's a big change in eating habits, but there's a lot of support out there to help people adapt. And for some people, the potential benefits might outweigh the challenges.
For sure. Especially if you can target cancer without all the nasty side effects of chemo and stuff.
Right. Now we need more research to really confirm how well it works in humans. But the KD is definitely a promising avenue for exploring how we can manipulate cancer cell metabolism.
So the KD is about shifting the whole metabolic landscape. But are there other ways to attack cancer cells through their metabolism?
Absolutely. Scientists are working on drugs that directly target the metabolic pathways cancer cells depend on. Like some drugs try to block fermentation, cut off their backup energy supply.
So it's like taking out their main power grid and their backup generators.
Yeah. Exactly, leave them in the dark. This approach of combining diet with targeted therapies is a really exciting area of research. It could lead to more personalized and effective treatments.
It all sounds super promising, but I bet there are people who aren't buying into this whole metabolic theory. What kind of pushback has Seyfried gotten?
Well, not everyone's convinced that it explains everything about cancer. Some people argue that mitochondrial dysfunction might contribute, but it can't account for all the genetic mutations we see.
So they're saying it's not an either thing, like both genes and metabolism are involved.
Right. And that's a fair point. Seyfried's work has really shaken things up in the cancer world. He's challenging the status quo and forcing people to reconsider the fundamental nature of the disease. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's like shaking up the snow globe and seeing how everything settles in a new pattern.
Exactly.
And, thinking about all this from a philosophical perspective, it really raises some deep questions. Like, how does this metabolic view of cancer change how we understand disease? How do our genes and our environment interact?
Does it change how you think about cause and effect? The balance between order and chaos in the human body? These are all things worth pondering.
Yeah, for sure. This deep dive is just the beginning of the conversation. Now, before we wrap up, there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to address. We've talked about the strengths of the metabolic theory, but it's also faced its fair share of criticism and controversy. And it's important to take a look at those too.
Okay, so we've really gone deep on this metabolic theory of cancer.
Yeah,
But like with any big new idea, there are always going to be folks who aren't quite convinced.
of course.
What are some of the main criticisms or like pushback Seyfried's work has gotten.
Well, one of the big ones is how the metabolic theory explains metastasis.
Ah, yeah, metastasis.
You know how cancer spreads to different parts of the body?
Right. That's what often makes cancer so dangerous and hard to treat.
Exactly. And some critics say Seyfried's model doesn't really address why certain cancers tend to spread to specific organs. Like, why does breast cancer often go to the bones, lungs, or liver?
Yeah, that's a good point. So Seyfried tries to address this by saying metastasis isn't totally random. He thinks it's influenced by the metabolic microenvironment of different tissues. Like some organs might just be more welcoming to cancer cells based on what nutrients they have or their overall metabolic profile.
So it's kind of like how different cities attract different types of tourists.
Yeah,
Like a beach town is going to draw sunbathers, while a foodie city is going to attract people who love to eat.
exactly. Seyfried's suggesting that certain tissues might have a metabolic signature that makes them more vulnerable to specific types of cancer cells. But this part of his theory still needs a lot more research to really flesh it out.
Makes sense.
Sure.
Metastasis is super complex.
It really is.
Okay, what about the keto diet? We talked about it as a possible treatment,
Right.
but are there concerns about how effective it really is?
Definitely. There's been some promising research in animals showing that the keto diet can slow tumor growth,
Okay.
but the evidence in humans isn't as strong yet. Some people with cancer have reported positive results, but we need those big randomized controlled trials to really know for sure if it works as a standalone cancer treatment.
So the keto diet is interesting, but it's not a magic bullet.
Definitely not.
And it's important to say people shouldn't ditch conventional treatments and just go keto without talking to their doctor.
Absolutely. Any new treatment should be discussed with a medical professional.
Right. And this brings up a bigger point about the whole metabolic theory of cancer. It's not about throwing out the gene theory or all the progress we've made in genetics.
Right. It's not an either situation.
It's about expanding our understanding,
Yeah.
adding new layers and looking at the whole picture.
Exactly. Seyfried himself acknowledges that genetic mutations can happen because of metabolic problems, and then those mutations make the cancer worse. It's a complex dance between our genes and our environment.
Between the instructions in our DNA and the fuel that runs our cells.
Yeah, a really intricate interplay.
So maybe the biggest takeaway from Seyfried's work is that we need a more holistic approach to cancer in research and treatment.
Totally. We need to consider both the genetic and the metabolic sides of things.
And that might lead to new and better therapies, whether it's diet, drugs that target specific metabolic pathways, or a combination of approaches.
Yeah, possibilities are really exciting.
So for all our listeners out there, especially those who love to ponder the big questions, I think this deep dive has uncovered something really profound. It shows how interconnected everything is, this intricate web of relationships that governs life on every level.
It reminds us that we can't just focus on one thing in isolation, like just genes or just metabolism, and expect to have all the answers.
Yeah, the world is messy and complex and full of surprises.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. To make progress in any field, we need to be willing to question, challenge the dogma, and be open to new ideas.
Whether it's science, philosophy, or anything else. So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep that curiosity burning bright. This deep dive might be over for now, but the conversation's just getting started.